Like, what have you done to my mum? What have you done to my mum?
That was the voice of Lee Lawrence. He's describing the moment a group of men stormed into his flat, armed with guns. One of them shot his mother, Cherry Groce. But the man who pulled the trigger was a copper. The Met Police raided their home in Brixton in September '85. Cherry was left paralysed. The officers were looking for one of her other sons, but he wasn't there. In fact, he didn't even live there at all. What followed was a wave of anger, pain, and defiance that spread through the streets of Brixton. It was a community that had already seen too much harassment, too much inequality, too much violence, too much loss. It became one of the biggest uprisings in British history. A movement was born that forced the authorities to confront questions of race, justice, and accountability. In this episode, we take you back to the moment where the people started the fight back against the state. So 40 years on, how much has really changed? Welcome to the Crime Agents. Welcome back to the Crime Agents with me, crime journalist Andy Hughes.
And me, the ex-cop, Neil Basu.
Neil, there's been rioting and uprisings for centuries in this country, but it was in the 1980s that we saw the beginning of a new movement. It was a time of rising unemployment, poor housing conditions, and the minority communities and working class communities, they just had enough. And certainly amongst the black communities in London and Liverpool, there was a feeling that the police were racist, and particularly their use of the sus laws, which we've discussed before, of course, which basically allowed them to stop anyone acting suspiciously. But in fact, what you saw was police just stopping loads of the black community. And all of these factors together, they fueled a huge wave of anger, and it was just inevitable that this was the beginning of the resistance. In April 1981, there was wide-scale violence in Brixton. Hundreds of locals were injured, as well as more than 300 police officers. And then just a few weeks later, the Toxteth riots, that really highlighted the fact that the government and the police were facing a problem on a national scale. Now, Neil, when I've looked back at this, as always, when I do research, I look at clips of what the politicians were saying, what the leaders were saying. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister at the time. It just seems so tone deaf what they were saying, as well as the police leaders. There was no sense that they understood the situation that the people they were meant to protect were in. For example, Norman Tebbit, the Employment Secretary at the time. Have a listen to this.
I know those problems. I grew up in the 30s with an unemployed father. He didn't riot. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he kept looking till he found it.
How tone deaf is that?
Well, there wasn't a great deal of sympathy from the political classes, but and this is where policing and politics tends to collide. I mean, policing and the Thatcher government were very close. Thatcher was trying all kinds of economic experiments. We'd just come out of the 70s with a 3-day week, and she was trying to turn the country around, but the stuff she was doing was causing a great deal of friction with working class and unemployed people. And what she needed, because she knew that effectively there was going to be potentially disorder and protest, even riot, was a police force that was on side. So actually it was a very pro-police administration, but it was a very anti-working class, anti-minority government. And it had come from, if you remember back in 68, we've talked about this before, the Rivers of Blood speech. Enoch Powell was the most popular Conservative politician in the country when he made that speech. He fired him immediately, but of course Thatcher was rising through the party at the time, and she recognised that kind of anti-immigration sentiment, and that would be quite powerful, and that translated into a lot of Conservative policy and, as you said, a lot of tone-deaf stuff that I remember growing up as a child in the 70s and 80s was pretty horrific if you looked like me.
Yeah, and then just a few years after that uprising, it was September 1985 when police officers raided the home of Cherry Groce in Brixton. They were searching for a son, Michael Groce, who was wanted in connection with a firearms offence at the time. During the raid, an officer shot Cherry in the back, leaving her paralysed from the waist down. Her son wasn't in the house at the time. One of her other sons, Lee Lawrence, was, and we're going to hear from him shortly. The shooting sparked immediate outrage in the local community, leading to 2 days of rioting. And then just weeks later in Tottenham, police raided the home of Cynthia Jarrett. Again, they were looking for a son, but one of the officers pushed past Cynthia and she collapsed and died of heart failure. And this led to yet another uprising in Broadwater Farm. This one was huge, and it was during this riot that a police officer, PC Keith Blakelock, was brutally murdered, and that case is still unsolved. And what's interesting about all these cases we're talking about, Neil, those are still felt on the streets today. If you go into Broadwater Farm and ask the community there, a lot of them, I'm not saying the majority, but a lot of them will still not like the police because of what happened in 1985 and what happened to Cynthia Jarrett. And on the other foot, if you ask police officers who actually have to police Broadwater Farm, they don't like going in there because of the resistance. They know they're not liked. And also, there's some sense of feeling, and I know this because I still speak to police officers on the front line, they still think that that will never be repaired, that relationship, fully, because the police certainly feel that you took one of our own. And sorry, Neil, before you answer that, just to paint a picture of what Broadwater Farm was like back then, it really became a huge powder keg, this place, because what happened was this estate was built in the 60s and it was meant as this, this new housing estate, and they moved loads of the wealthy middle-class white people in. But straight after, it became infested with rats. It became a terrible place to live. So what happened? They got the white people out and put all the people who'd come in the Windrush generation in. And then the police. And then basically all around this estate, you had members of the National Front just attacking it. And then because of the way this place was designed, it was effectively like a labyrinth. It was impossible for the police to trace criminals there because of all the different walkways and what have you. They would just always get away. So a lot of criminality was happening there. Therefore, the police were always there and they were always aggressive there. So there was already that tension between the black community there and then the police. And then when this police officer died, there you go.
Yeah, I'm pleased you've painted that picture because, people who certainly weren't as old as me will not understand what a bleak picture it really was. And I came from the West Midlands, so I could give you similar stories about Wolverhampton, Coventry, Birmingham, the Potteries, how it felt there in very similar circumstances. But it's important to understand just how tense the country was in terms of community and race relations, and the fact that police weren't really learning their lessons from 1981 and Brixton and the Scarman report. And it's Scarman pulled his punches. He went a bit short of calling the police institutionally racist. So it became that kind of almost that bad apples thing. But clearly we're at 1985 now and lessons have not been learnt. There's still a massive amount of over-policing and under-protecting of that community, and plus a lot of politics going on to keep that community down. And when you talk about Broadwater Farm, I shared when I was running a murder squad back in the early noughties, I shared a corridor with the office of the team that was reinvestigating Keith Blakelock. Oh. So I know exactly how cops of my generation and a few years older than me felt when you talked about they took one of ours, we need to get justice. There was definitely that feeling, not in an unprofessional way, but in a way that made them, very committed to that inquiry. And of course, the original people who were convicted for that inquiry was later found to be a miscarriage of justice. So there's grievance on both sides, and that tension is very difficult for a modern police officer, a young person joining policing today, who is sent to police a community that has a large number, black population, particularly black Afro-Caribbean post-Windrush generation. They can't understand why that tension's there because they don't know anything about it because they didn't grow up with it. And that's why it's so important to listen to Lee, and more importantly, read his book, because the picture you've painted is illustrated throughout his book. You understand how that trauma is passed down from father to son. So a grandparent's generation telling their father, and it's particularly the men because they're the ones most over-policed, telling their son, what happened to them, and then the father telling his son what happened to him. And that generation of, being stopped and searched and harassed and potentially fitted up, that has been passed, down and down, and is still very, very prevalent in communities today, which you know from your journalism and I know from my policing experience.
And at the top of the show, I asked, where are we now? And there is no one better to answer that question than Lee Lawrence. He's the son of Cherry Groce, and we're going to speak to him after the break. Lee, thanks so much for joining us. Pleasure to have you in. Could you just talk us through What happened to your mum?
So I will start with that morning. Well, the night before, we would have all been in my mum's room watching TV, watching the one TV, and that was usual on a weekend. I fell asleep in my mum's room, and around 7 a.m. on the 28th of September 1985, I heard a noise, and I woke up. I was still kind of semi-asleep. You know, you wake up, you're not fully alert. But I saw Mum walking towards the door, and I thought, whatever it is, Mum's taking care of it, and I lied back down. And then I heard another loud bang this time, and this time I jumped up, fully alert, fully awake, and I saw my mum on the floor. I saw a man with a gun in his hand. He was shouting at my mum, aggressively, repeatedly asking for my brother, Michael Groce, who wasn't there and didn't live with us. And I just heard my mum in a faint voice say, I can't breathe, I can't feel my legs, and I think I'm going to die. And hearing that just freaked me out. I just was hysterical. I started shouting at this man, what have we done to my mum? What have we done to my mum? I think I was actually even swearing and everything. I just felt this rage come over me that I've never felt in my whole entire life. And I remember being eye shot with the person who had the gun, because I was standing on the bed, so it was at the same height.
Because you were just 11 then, right?
Yeah, I was just 11. I just started secondary school, just 2 weeks in. And he just pointed the gun at me and said, you know, someone better shut this fucking kid up. And I froze. And it was only then I realised it was a police officer, which shocked me because I idolised the police up until that point. I was into all the cop programmes, Starsky and Hutch, you know, Kojak, Chips. My favourite was The Professionals. So I was the kid role playing in my house all the time. So
had you ever thought about being a cop?
Yeah, I wanted to be a police officer. If you'd asked me at that age, Lee, would you want to be when you grow up? I would have said a police officer, because up until that point, I saw the police as the heroes. They were the ones that protected people, and so therefore, I wanted to be that guy. So in this moment, it was just I just couldn't get my head around what was happening, and I froze when that gun got pointed at me, and my dad was in the room. And I saw the fear on my dad's face, and I knew it was serious because he had spent 9 years in the army, so and he was a security guard at the time. So when I saw him with him look like he was scared, I thought, no, this is definitely serious. And then we just got kind of pushed out of the bedroom into the living room. I was joined by the rest of my siblings: Juliet, 21, 6 months pregnant; Sharon, 13. Lisa, 8, and my mum was babysitting 2 other children, a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old. And it just felt like someone picked up my house and just shook it upside down. There was about 30 officers in the house, got guns, dogs. It was just mayhem. And I just remember thinking, is my mum going to be all right? That's all I was worried about, because the last time I saw her, she was just wounded, and no one could give us any answers. She got rushed off to the hospital moments after. And then there was a news bulletin that my mum had passed. And I remember running into the kitchen, grabbing a knife, trying to slit my wrist, because I thought, if my mum, she was my world. I thought, if she's not here, I don't want to be here. And it was a female police officer who grabbed a knife on me. And so that news spread within our community, and we lived in a real tight-knit community. It was, you know, when they say it takes a village to raise a child, that's how I felt living in Brixton. I felt safe. It was exciting. We played out in the streets. I knew everyone. Everyone knew my mum. So when they came to the house, first of all, they wanted to find out what happened, and then second of all, they wanted to check if we were all right as the children, and they wouldn't let anyone in the house to check on us. And that's when they decided to march down from where we lived to Brixton Police Station, which would have been about 25-30-minute walk. Mm-hmm. And as they were walking, it was galvanised more momentum. And by the time they got to Brixton Police Station, there was probably hundreds of people outside demanding to know what happened. They weren't getting any answers. That turned into frustration. Frustration turned into anger. Anger turned into violence. And that's the catalyst for the second waves of, famously known riots in Brixton, but we call it an uprising.
And incredibly important to realise, for Metropolitan Policing, it was 4 years after the 1981 uprising caused by Operation Swamp, which, most importantly, you brilliantly recount in your book, which is why you're here, Glee, because I wanted to help you sell this quite remarkable. I listened to this, the audio version, back to back yesterday. So that's 9 hours without stopping. I probably got a bad back today because of it, Lee. But this is called The Colour of Injustice. I brought in my own copy of The Louder I Will Sing, which is the story of the shooting of your mum, which I'm hoping you'll sign for me later. That was a Costa biography award-winning book of 2020, still selling today, 5 years later. And this was an incredibly emotional moment because I hope you don't mind if I say this, Lee. I wish you'd never met me, and I wish I'd never had to meet you. And of course, we met back in, I think, 2013 when I was commander of South East London, and I was asked to be the gold commander for the inquest into your mother's death because, of course, when she died, I think it was Dick Shepherd, who was the Home Office pathologist, made it very clear that she died of the injuries caused by her shooting, which this year will be 40 years ago.
And how long after the shooting did your mother pass?
26 years
26 years.
So she was given a life expectancy of 10 and compensated for that amount of time that she lived for 26 years, 16 years after. And rightfully so, when they connected her death to the original incident, which then allowed us to revisit what happened, it was a shock for us because we didn't expect that at all. In my mind, my mum's passed. We're already thinking about, we've got to bury my mum, we've got to go, and it was only when I went to go and get the death certificate that I realised that the person said, we can't give it to you because we think there's going to be an inquest into your mum's death. And I was thinking, I don't even know what an inquest is. Right. And from that point, I made it my duty to get all the details around what this means, what are the possibilities, and just poured all of that energy into that process, because when mum passed, all the feelings of hurt, pain, trauma, injustice, came back to the surface because we suppressed that for so long. And I had all sorts of negative thoughts about what am I going to do about this? How am I going to revenge what happened to my mum? All those sort of really dark thoughts came into my head. Yeah.
Can you tell me, Lee, because, obviously we met, I think, when you were frustrated, angry, but remarkably articulate. I think you probably knew more about inquest than your first lawyer that we met together. But
yeah.
Just can I take you back, if that's possible? Because you mentioned, your siblings were in the house with you. You'd gone from being this kid who possibly could have joined policing and thought, you use a remarkable comment in your book, The Colour of Injustice, where you saw, police are a force, but I wanted them to be a force for good. Now, that changed the day your mother was shot. Do you mind telling me what happened to you and your siblings and how that 26 years, I know that's a very difficult thing to do in a short space of time, but just tell me what happened, what led you to those feelings 26 years later?
So straight away we were displaced. Who would have thought that when I saw my mum walk into that door, that would be the last time I'd ever see her walk? So the next time I met my mum after the incident was in hospital, days later in St. Thomas's Hospital. And I remember the doctor coming in and explaining that she'd been shot in her shoulder, the bullet punctured her lung, hit her spine, came out through her hip. And as a result of that, fragments of the bullet was lodged in her spine and they couldn't remove it for fear of further damage. Now she was going to be permanently paralysed and will never walk again. So, hearing that was just devastating, and I could only imagine how my mum must have felt. But as an 11-year-old, I made a commitment to myself to say, I can't rely on my mum to look after me. I'm going to have to look after her. And I dedicated myself, my life, to being a carer. So initially she was in hospital in St. Thomas's for a while, and I remember every day go to school, come home, change my clothes, get on the bus 109 to Westminster, go to Syrian Hospital. I'd sit there till 9, 10 o'clock in the evening until they kicked me out. I'd go back home, and at that time I'm staying with a family friend in Summerleyton Estate. So this estate was, it's dark when you walk in there. It's intimidating, but I'm having to do that walk every day because I had to go and see my mum every day.
You talked before about when you were a kid you wanted to be a police officer. How did you feel after that?
Well, I then had a first-hand experience of policing and how black people are treated differently. And if it was a situation where they burst into my home and they shot my mum, and I saw that officer act in a way where he was remorseful or felt sorry or went to my mum's aid, or when he saw me screaming, I saw him say, "Oh, I'm really, really sorry," and I saw him looking really distressed about it, it might have changed my view on it.
Right.
But because he didn't, he was still aggressive after he shot my mum. The way he spoke to me and pointed his gun at me, I will never forget that.
Right.
And then it was reinforced as a young black teenager growing up in the inner city. I'm now being stopped and searched myself. I couldn't tell you how many times I've been stopped and searched, arrested, put into a cell. I haven't got a criminal record, but I can't tell you how many times I've been arrested and been put into a cell. So therefore, I was starting to have my own experiences. At the age of 13, I think was the first time I got arrested. And when we got thrown into the van, they were calling us monkeys. And I started giggling because I couldn't even believe that I was hearing this, that, wow, this stuff really happens. So now we could have looked at what happened to my mum as a really isolated, unique situation. But now I'm having my own experiences as a teenager and how the police view me, how they treat me, just reinforced the experience that I had in my home at the age of 11 when they shot my mum in front of me. So that was hard. And growing up as a teenager and juggling, caring for your mum, but going to school and trying to work out who you are as a person and fit into society. And it was very difficult. And we didn't get no support around what happened, no therapy. So therefore you're left as a damaged child, going to school, taking out your anger, your frustration and everything on teachers and other children, so on and so forth.
And yet here you are, and you now work with the police. Why did you decide to do that, given what they did to your family? How they took away your childhood?
Well, Neil Basu here to my left is played a huge part in me being in the position that I'm in right now. So it was a journey. And initially when my mum passed and the inquest was open into my mum's death, we wanted to make sure that the truth was heard within that inquest. So the first issue we had is that we couldn't get legal aid. We were denied on 3 separate occasions, so we had to campaign through change.org. We got over 100,000 people to sign. Went to 10 Downing Street, handed that in, and then that decision was overturned. So we had access to lawyers. That means we could have a voice. Then there was this internal investigation report that was done by West Yorkshire that we were trying to get access to, and there was resistance around getting that report. Back and forth. And I remember the first day of the inquest, Neil Basu came in because I asked to speak to the commissioner before we started, because I was thinking to myself, and Neil came to me and said, I want to offer you an apology, but we have to wait to the inquest is dealt with first and we get an outcome from that. And I remember saying, if you want this apology to be meaningful, then you can't be fighting us through the process of this inquest.
I was sitting in a meeting on that day and Lee rang me up, and he's being very diplomatic about what he actually said.
I bet.
Because I hadn't realised, I'd instructed my barrister to give you a copy of that report, and he was withholding it. And I had a conversation with my barrister, which was, I don't represent you, I represent the Commissioner. And I said, for all intents and purposes, I am the commissioner, I'm the client for this. In the end, I had to go down to Tennis Court where the inquest was being held, on blue lights and two-tones, take the report and physically hand it to Lee.
Right.
And this is 29 years later, I think.
29
So
years
the family had never seen this report. Now, of course, I had read this report, and by the time the inquest happened, I was head of armed policing. So I had shown that report to the chief firearm instructor of the Metropolitan Police, and I said, who had been almost a 30-year serving cop, so he'd been in the Met at the time. I said, I want to take you back to the 80s and tell me, was that a good firearms operation? Forget where you are now, a chief firearms instructor in 2014. Forget that, because we know how we'd do things differently now. Read this and tell me, was that the best we could do in 1985? And he turned to me and he said, that is a crap firearms operation, which is pretty much what the ACC in West Yorkshire, Richard DeMail, had come to the conclusion of, which actually led to criminal charges against the officer who shot your mum. So West Yorkshire had done their job, held the Metropolitan Police to account, and the family hadn't been shown that report for 29 years. So two scandals, one that a bereaved family doesn't get legal aid, whereas policing gets the high-priced Queen's Counsel then, King's Counsel now. And secondly, that they're not given the disclosure to allow them to question what happened on that day. And it was a real seminal moment for me as a commander with, 20 years experience in policing, thinking, this isn't right. None of this is right, which is why your first book was so profound for me, because I remember every meeting we had, Lee. But I remembered most the mediation we went into afterwards. And it was taken over when I was moved on to by a very good friend of mine, Mac Chishti. And I remember him coming to see me and say, you won't believe this, but as part of the restorative justice, Lee wants to teach police officers. And I thought, I have to admit, I had a bit of a pause then, Lee. So talk us through that decision-making and why you wanted to do that.
And what you actually do as well.
So firstly, I'll kind of go back to a bit about the inquest when you came that day, because not only was there like full disclosure of the report, but there was also an acceptance of what was in there, the report, the findings in that report, which changed the whole trajectory of the whole process, because that meant that the Met was no longer objecting to anything that was happening in the inquest process. And I feel that played a massive part to the outcome as well. So then there was that. It was found to be multiple serious failings by the Met. There was a public apology from the commissioner at the time, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe. And I remember him coming to our solicitor's office and giving that apology in person. And me then saying, okay, you're saying you're sorry. The person who most deserved to hear that is my mum. Yeah. She's not here, sadly. So we didn't just step on our toes. We need some accountability. And at that time he said, well, I can't agree to that now. I will speak to the powers that be, and if worst case scenario, I'll put you in the room with those people. I said, fair enough. About a week later, we got a letter from his solicitor saying, we're not going to accept accountability because we owed no duty of care to the children who were in the house who witnessed what happened. So that felt like a kick in the balls. And the battle gear went on again. Yeah. We ended up in the High Court, and it was on in the High Court that Met conceded and accepted accountability, which then the High Court judge recommended we go into mediation. And mediation was something, again, had no idea of that process. I had no idea about restorative justice. I had to do a crash course in trying to get my head around it. And I remember leading up to it, my barrister was saying we should only speak about stuff in mediation that would stand up in court if we ended up back in court. And I disagreed. I remember kicking back on that and saying, no, if the damage that's been caused is the length of the table that we're on, I want to talk about the length of the table. I don't see why we should reduce that. And he goes, okay, Lee, maybe you should do all the talking. I thought, okay. And then I felt the huge weight on my shoulders, because now I'm not just representing myself, it's my family, my siblings. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to say. And I thought, how do I make this meaningful? And it came to me that 24 hours before, I said, I'm going to use pictures. And I remember calling my solicitor saying, I know what I'm going to do now. And he goes, well, Lee, it's too late because we got mediation tomorrow. So whatever you're going to do, I trust you, right? And we went into the room. I got these copies of pictures made up, and I gave everybody their copies. And I decided to take everyone through a journey of using pictures to tell the story. Who was my mum? She wasn't just this person who was shot that sparked, the Brixton uprising. She meant much more than that to us. And I described who she was as a person. I described little Lee and his ambitions to be a police officer, and that was crashed on that day. And went through a whole series of different pictures. And too, I spoke about my daughter, who was 8 at the time, who was the same age as my youngest sister was at the time. And the correlation between that, because we were adults in the room at the time, but the fact that my daughter had this book that she was walking out the door going to school with that had the word police on it, and how I froze and thought, when I called her and asked her was she reading, and she was so excited to tell me, it reminded me of my younger self.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But I'm thinking, I've got to tell you this personal story about what we've gone through as a family. Yeah. How do I do that with balance? And I looked at Neil in the room and I said, how I told my daughter that story is down to you and how we resolve this today. Right. And then that was it. It was almost like the kind of drop mic moment. And
it literally was.
It literally was.
You probably couldn't see, because you were so in the moment delivering that. You probably couldn't see the mediator's expression, who's a judge. Had I wanted to contest it, but you had me at hello, to paraphrase Jerry Maguire. I mean, it was quite the most powerful thing. A story of wrong. So your book, The Colour of Injustice, you had experienced it and then articulated it in a very powerful way, in an incredibly cogent way. I mean, you could have told your story for years. I know you could have, but in that moment, almost everything I had been feeling since probably the publication of the Macpherson report in 1999 became really crystal clear. As a serving cop who tried to defend sometimes the indefensible, this was probably the first time I hadn't, and you did that. And your book does that as well. I mean, I wish that book is a remarkable telling of the history of injustice in this country, and it's pre-Windrush. There's an amazing post-World War I story. There's stories I consider myself very well read in the history of racial injustice when policing is involved, and I talk about it myself. There were stories that I knew nothing about. My view is it should be required reading for every, certainly metropolitan police officer, because of who you are, Lee, and what you do for us today. But every police officer should read that. And I will want to ask, if Andy gives me a bit of leeway, a few questions on that. But in terms of what you're teaching in the Metropolitan Police now, aren't you? Tell me and Andy a little bit about what you're doing for cops today.
So I don't want to miss out this really important part. In that drop the mic moment was, I'm now waiting for a response and I'm waiting for a challenge. And Neil gets up and he says, my lawyers ain't going to like what I'm going to say, which I knew, okay, this is going to be off the record then. And he said, but he just said to me, I would hate for my mum to go through what your mum went through. And in that moment, I knew what I was trying to achieve worked, because there was empathy. He connected to his own mother. We were two sons who loved their mothers dearly. And for the mere fact that he was able to connect to that in that moment showed me, okay, the pennies dropped, you got it. And so therefore, I will say the healing process began in that response to what I had said, and that response that he, in turn came out with. So we then went into some meaningful conversations. There was a bit of back and forth. But my thing was this. I didn't want to just hear that lessons have been learned or will be learned and they will be applied. My thing was about, I want to be on that journey. I want to see this for myself. So that's why there was an urge at that time to want to get involved. And essentially, a lot of the work that I do and the presentations that I do up to today tells that story.
Right.
Because what I am trying to do is build understanding. What I am trying to do is build empathy. And if they hear a story about, you know, this terrible injustice, but it ended in a way where there was a human to human, heart to heart encounter, which was the moment that shifted things and allowed things to move forward in a different way, then to me that's the most key part of the message. If we're looking at how do we reconcile, so the new book attempts to do that in a more deeper way by saying, okay, you might read my book and see what happened to me, and again it feels like really isolated, really unusual for something like this to happen. But when you look at these stories time and time and time again, you're seeing very familiar themes within, you know, these other cases of racial injustices.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we really want to break those cycles, we've got to understand it. We've got to have some empathy around that, and we've got to learn most importantly and apply those lessons. And that's what I'm attempting to do through the work that I do and through the book that I've written, or the books.
Lee, we're going to have to say goodbye to you now, but just before we go, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where are we now.
Where are we? So when I saw that thing about Charing Cross, for me, I was like, okay, I wasn't shocked. And if anything, I'm glad that it's being exposed, because that's what needs to happen. We need to wake up to the reality of what's really happening. And it's only when we do that and accept that, then we can really meaningfully move forward. So this not accepting institutional racism, it's like if you go to the doctors and the doctor doesn't diagnose you properly, then you can't get the right treatment, right, to be cured. And that's how I feel about that statement. Until we can really accept what it is, we can never really find the right solutions to deal with it. However, I remember my barrister said to me once, Lee, the system's broken, but we still got to engage in that broken system. So giving up is not an option for me.
Thanks so much, Lee. Pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
What an extraordinary journey Lee has had. He's gone from a young boy wanting to become a police officer to then hating the police and now trying to make the police better.
That was an extraordinary interview and incredibly emotional. I obviously know Lee's story from start to finish because of the relationship we shared with all its ups and downs when I was a serving police officer. I had no idea I'd had that impact on him, but I'll tell you one remarkable thing, that back in 2021, we're still in COVID, he unveiled in Windrush Square in Brixton an amazing sculpture, a memorial to his mother, which they had raised the funds for a very famous sculptor called David Adeja to do this magnificent piece of art. And the crowd it drew was unbelievable. Now, I was standing there in full uniform and Lee asked me to speak to the crowd. And there were two other police officers there from Lambeth who were effectively trying to... They were escorting me because they were so worried about me. Now, I was a DS back in Lambeth in the old days. I love Brixton. It's a sort of second home. I understand what it can be like. I didn't need an escort there, but it is instructive that only two other police officers were there in that what was a very large crowd, and we're in COVID, so people are trying to distance, but let's be honest, that's not going to happen. And the speeches were so incredibly moving. But we've just been talking about the fact that police officers really don't understand the trauma that's passed down through generations. That crowd had everyone in it from 5 years old to 75 years old, all of which were there for Cherry, all of which were there for Lee and his family. Yeah. Lee was there with his 8-year-old daughter, not much younger than he was when it happened. It was incredibly emotional, and more police officers have to understand what has happened to that community when they are interacting with them today. Whether as victim or perpetrator, they have to understand what happened, and that's why he's done a remarkable thing, coming to speak to us, but also writing that incredibly moving book.
He's incredibly open, isn't he? And the thing is, Neil, no one would have blamed him for going through the rest of his life just hating the police. That's what quite a lot of people do who have interactions with the police that he's had. Yeah,
I'm sure you put yourself in his shoes when he was telling that story.
Yeah.
I certainly did.
Yeah.
There's no way I could have forgiven what happened to
no.
his mother and to his
No way.
siblings and what happened to him.
No way. I
You
could have
said
done
it, you had your childhood stolen. Well, for him to come back and then try and teach a new generation of cops how to be better, I mean, what a man.
Yeah. Well, I certainly couldn't do it myself. Shall we leave it there, Neil?
I think so.
Yeah, let's end on that note. Thanks for listening to The Crime Agents. We'll be back next week. Goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.